Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to AAFSW special event. This is a conversation with our very own Judy Ikels, who has written a new book, Death in Wartime China, A Daughter's Discovery. This is really an amazing story of how an email from a stranger ultimately led Judy to researching and writing a book about the father she never knew. It's really amazing. I'm your host, Melissa Hess, and with me is Nicole Spiridakis, and she is AAFSW's webmaster and social media coordinator. So Nicole is our technical guru, and she's going to be monitoring the chat room for us today. So before we get started, a few quick housekeeping items. Everyone, please turn off your camera and mute your microphone when you're not speaking. That way we don't have any background noise, and we also conserve bandwidth. And please feel free to write your questions in the chat. We will have a Q&A session at the end, and we can address the questions there. Also, you can use the raise hand feature, and Nicole, who's monitoring this for us, will call on you, and we can do it that way as well. So let's begin. Let me just say that I first met Judy about 20 years ago when Judy was the deputy director in the Family Liaison Office, now known, of course, as the Global Community Liaison Office. And I was in the employment section. So we actually go back a long way, she and I. Let me share with you some of her background. She has a very rich background, a longtime member of AAFSW. She also had a 28-year career as a civil servant, and it was a very distinguished one, at that. She served as community liaison coordinator in Rio. She also worked at the Overseas Briefing Center in Washington, the Family Liaison Office, and as the chief of work-life division in the Office of Employee Relations. And she was working directly on policies to support foreign service families and employees in that position. Judy was also the 2017 recipient of AAFSW's Tragan Award for supporting family member employment, and she also received the 2019 Director General's Cup. So she is truly an advocate for foreign service families. Judy also served with her late husband, Larry Ikels, an FSO with the United States Information Agency, in 6 overseas assignments. They were in El Salvador, Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico, Brazil, and Greece. So Judy, we're very excited to have you here, and we're anxious to hear more about this remarkable story. So with that, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Melissa. This is like old times. It's like working together again. I really appreciate it. And Nicole, thank you so much for getting the technical part set up. I'm always in admiration of anybody who can drive the Zoom. I'm very happy to introduce you to this book and to give you a little background on it, a few things that you'll see in the book and probably a few things that will be extra. So let's get started with the first slide. I'd like to introduce you to my birth father. His name was William H. Wallace, Jr. He was born in Dallas, Texas, as was I, but he died on June the 10th in 1944, serving in World War II in a part of the war that is not perhaps as well known as some of the other parts of World War II. People always think, of course, of the South Pacific, and they think of the war in Europe. But Bill was fighting in China, defending the Chinese against the Japanese invasion. And that part of the war was called the CBI, or the China, Burma, India Theater. That was his mission. So let's move ahead. Nicole, can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes, I'm for some reason.
Okay.
Yeah, no, okay, sorry. It just froze for a second.
Okay, sorry. So just a quick map, look at the map of China. He was serving down in Yunnan province, which is the province at the very south of China. In fact, they call it south of the clouds in Yunnan. And also on the map is Kunming, which is the principal city in that province. And that was one of the places where there was an air base along with a city called Guilin. Let's move ahead. He was flying a B-24 Liberator low-altitude bomber. This was a plane that was developed especially for this kind of work. The United States built some 18,000 B-24s during the war and by the end of the war. This one is always very recognizable because it has those two balancing tail ovals, and this is a 4-engine plane that he was flying. It's hard to see in this picture, but there is a little cupola on top of the plane where a gunner would sit. And there were also openings on the side of the plane where they called them wiggly-eared gunners could perch. And they actually used firearms to shoot out of this plane, which just really sends chills up my spine. I'll tell you a little bit more about the B-24 later. I did a lot of research. It was a miracle of modern aviation at the time, but still had very rudimentary radar by our standards today. Let's move ahead. So in the beginning of the war, and what you may remember from going to the movies or seeing old newsreels in historical documentaries, in the beginning, the B-24 flyers were solo knight errants of the sky. They were flying planes that just flying solo against the Japanese Zero planes. But later in the war, in 44 and in the beginning of 45 until the end of the war, they realized that one of the main things they could do to slow the war down was to take out shipping and disrupt the supply chain of the Japanese. Since 1937, the Japanese had been invading China, and there were over 1 million Japanese soldiers in China. And they were using the Yangtze River to haul out industrial supplies and so forth to fuel their the industrialization and the wartime effort. And so the flyers in South China were going up to the Yangtze River to bomb shipping and Japanese posts along that river. The mighty Yangtze River, it's the longest river in the world inside any one geographic area. Let's move ahead. This is my father's flight crew. Bill is on the front row, the second from the left. Not all of these flyers were with him the night of the incident, but Bill and 7 others were on that flight. And so what happened on the night of the 10th is that the flyers had been out on an 11-hour mission, bombing mission, and they came back and were expected to land at Guilin. But it was impossible because too many planes were in the air over that airstrip. Moreover, I read in the Dallas newspaper later that Japanese planes were involved as well. So what happened is that the radio tower or office, or I don't suppose there was really a tower there, but would turn on the radar for a few seconds and then turn it off, and then turn it on again for a few seconds and then turn it off, in order that the Japanese not get a homing on the base. But in doing so, Bill couldn't get a homing. He couldn't, the radar wasn't on long enough for him to be able to figure out where to land that plane. And it was at about this time that another solution appeared. The radio tower told him to fly to Kunming, which seemed like a good solution, but it was 2 hours away, and Bill was already very doubtful that he had 2 hours of fuel left. And in fact, he didn't. And on the way to Kunming, on the way to the airstrip at Kunming, he lost first one engine, and then the second, and then the third engine went out. And finally, he commanded the crew to parachute. And all 7 of his crewmen parachuted out safely. And that morning and later that day, all walked down from the mountain. But they realized very quickly that their pilot, as they wrote to my mother, their beloved pilot, was nowhere to be seen. He had perished in the jump. And the co-pilot wrote to my mother that he might have collided with something mid-air. It isn't clear because that was not part of the official report. At any rate, on that night, the Chinese from the village there, near where they landed, sent 2 men up to the mountain to stay with his body until the army could bring in horses to take him down the mountain. And so that was the incident. And let's look at the next slide. He was buried in China, as all of the soldiers were who lost their lives there, because they couldn't, it was too dangerous to try to bring deceased airmen home. As you might know, if you've read anything about this part of the war, the only way that the soldiers could get there in the first place to fight was to come over the Himalayas. Well, not exactly over, but rather through the Himalaya mountains, coming up from India. And every ounce of gasoline, every spark plug, every uniform, all the food, all the mail, everything had to be flown up from India. And so they were making these trips back and forth. And they couldn't use the gasoline and the airtime at that point, to repatriate deceased soldiers. And of course, they couldn't fly over the Pacific because of the war. That would have been way too dangerous. So let's move ahead. So 70 years went by. Of course, my family was very saddened by this loss. I knew about it. I was a little girl, but I didn't know a lot. And 70 years later, I got an email in my house here in Bethesda. And my sweet husband, Larry, was looking at the computer, and he said, "Judy, do you know anybody by the name of Pat Lucas?" I said, "No, Larry, just delete that email. I don't know who that is." And a minute went by. I was in the kitchen cooking dinner, and he came to me and he said, he brought me the laptop. He said, "Judy, I think you better sit down. I think you better sit down and read this email." And this is what it said. "Hi, Judy. I hope you'll forgive me for contacting you. I'm trying to get in touch with relatives of Ernestine Davenport Goodman. His first husband, Second Lieutenant William Hubert Wallace, Jr., was killed in World War II. We are desperate to find some images or more information about him for a memorial project. Pat Lucas, country representative in China at the Asia Foundation." Well, I was just flabbergasted. Let's look at the next slide. I was really taken aback by this. I could not imagine. So I wrote back very quickly, "Dear Dr. Lucas, Bill Wallace was my father. I never knew him. He died in China before I was born. I would love to learn more about your research and how you singled out Bill Wallace as a fallen soldier of interest." So let's move on. This was what I saw when I started doing a little research online. Now, I could have done this myself, but it had just never occurred to me that there might be something like this waiting for me in China. So a little of the backstory. Pat Lucas was he is an anthropologist. He's moved back to the United States now, but working for the Asia Foundation. He had been in China for 20 years, and he had, I think we could say, almost a hobby or a side interest of locating the families of people who served in World War II. But he could never find anyone who knew Bill Wallace. In over 10 years of looking, he had just not been able to find anyone. And he felt sad that someone lost their life there, but didn't seem to have any family members to remember him. So in 2006, Pat Lucas and a group of American college students and Chinese villagers cooperated and decided to put up this stone memorial to Lieutenant William H. Wallace, a B-24 bomber pilot, a young hero who knowingly exchanged his life, redeeming 7 others, June 10th, 1944, in English and, of course, in Chinese. Let's look ahead. This is what it looked like on the day of its dedication. Pat Lucas is that tall American man standing in the back, and all of these other patrons and American students were there as well. The other side of the memorial says, "May Americans and Chinese forever remember the shared sacrifices of our 2 great peoples in hope of friendship and peace." Let's look ahead. I just couldn't believe that this was sitting in China. I had no idea. I had no idea that it was there, or that anybody remembered, or that anyone cared. Well, our family here in Washington got busy, and we went out to Arlington Cemetery, all of us, my son and daughter, some of you may know, my son-in-law and grandchildren, and we spent a day out there and remembered Bill. Let's move ahead. And as a result of that trip to Arlington Cemetery, we decided to put together a little scrapbook of photographs. And that was the first idea that I had that maybe I could write something longer. It was fun to put that little photo book together. Let's look ahead. So in February of 2016, my sweet husband, Larry, and I boarded an airplane and we flew to China. We flew business class because he was 6'2", and that was the longest trip that we had taken since he retired from the Foreign Service. First, we went to Beijing to see friends who were living there at the time, and then we flew to South China. Let's move ahead. I don't know, I said before, I don't know what kind of reception I was expecting. I really didn't know what I was getting into. But it was a beautiful reception. Flowers at the airport. Let's move ahead. We had a huge welcome for us at the Civic Hall. Outside the Civic Hall, there was a sign that said, "To be the daughter of a hero is the highest honor." And it had my name on it. I was really overwhelmed. Let's move ahead. Then at this reception, everybody wanted to have their picture made with us. I said it was kind of like being at a wedding. Everybody wanted to have their picture made with the daughter of the Flying Tiger. Have I said enough about flying tigers yet? I may not have. Behind me, you'll see some Chinese decorations here. I put them up because 2022, the year I published my book, was also the year of the tiger, which is quite a coincidence because that's what they called these American flyers who were working in South China. You know, you may remember seeing pictures how they painted shark's teeth on the planes and then put, you know, sexy pinup girl pictures on. I don't know what my father's plane looked like, but they, the Americans thought that, well, the Japanese were probably afraid of sharks, so the planes were meant to look like sharks. But the Chinese in inland China didn't know anything about sharks. They thought it might be a tiger because that was their national symbol. And that's where the name Flying Tiger comes from. And it's a name that is still alive and well in the city of Kunming. There is a Flying Tigers Association. There's a Flying Tigers Museum. This one of the people that accompanied us had a security company that he called Flying Tigers. Still very popular. So after we had the reception and a dinner, we boarded, let's move ahead on the slides. We boarded a small bus that was arranged for us to go from Kunming up into the mountainside to see the monument. Next slide. Here's a picture of Pat Lucas and his little daughter. Well, not so little, she's a teenager, Alaya. She was so much fun and so helpful because, of course, she was fluent in English and Chinese. And she really stuck with me the whole time, anytime I needed translation. Next slide. So you can see Kunming right there in the middle of the map, which is the main city where we were. And the arrow on the right side of the map is the little village of Kinshuetang. This is the village that sponsored the memorial and where we were headed. Next slide. Here we are arriving. A little mountain village. It was about, 45 degrees the day we got there. And I had always wondered, what was it like? What was it like where my father spent his last days? This was so interesting to me. Everything interested me. Next slide. We were taken straight to the community hall to greet, so that the officials there could greet us. And this is a group of journalists that went with us everywhere. They're so young and so sweet, and they really asked good questions. They were so interested in this story. And you'll see later some of the slides do have Chinese characters on them, and those were the pictures that made the newspaper as far away as Bangladesh. Next slide. After we met, this is Mr. Zhu. He was our trip organizer. He knew where we were going, what time we were going to leave, where we were going to eat. He was just such a great guy. And I honestly can't remember if he spoke a little English or what, but we had no trouble communicating with him. Next slide. At this little village, they had this community center, and this was the outdoor patio area where we hosted, but the local cooks prepared a meal, and the goal was to thank people for remembering the Americans after all these years. It was a delicious meal. Next slide. And this was a familiar scene. I was giving thank you remarks to people, and Pat, of course, was translating for me. And you can see by the Chinese characters, this is one of the photos that made the local newspaper. Next. It was quite a big crowd we had there that day. And there was a roaring fire going in the fireplace, but as you can see, everyone kept their coats on for lunch. Next. So walking out from the village, this is how many Chinese rural communities are set up, where there is a local community house, but then to get to other houses, you go on foot. When that bus dropped us off, that was really what you might say was the end of the road. And here I am walking with a woman I called Mrs. Lee. What we learned during our preparation for this trip is that there was one local family that had been especially interested in Bill's story of heroism and the fact that I was coming, and that was the Lee family. And they had gone so far as to adopt Bill into their family, so to speak, and give him a Chinese name. You can see it written there. They named him the surname Li, the middle name Shu for the generational name for people of his generation, and Hua, which is the sound that is closest to Wallace. But I later learned it also means China. Let's move ahead. This is the farmhouse, very typical. It was a two-story around a compound with, let's move ahead, with the animals living underneath the house, which is very typical. The baby grandson, of course, was the one person that did not need translation. We had so much fun with him, and Alaya in particular, because of course she could speak Chinese with him. So let's move ahead. After we had some refreshments and had gotten settled into the house, then it was time to take a walk to the memorial. And one of the security guards that was with us was holding my coat. I got warm as we were walking over, but you can see in early February, the fields were plowed, ready for spring planting. Let's move ahead. And finally, we were at the memorial that I had first seen on the internet. And I was so pleased to see that it was in clean and good condition after so many years. It had been standing there for 10 years without us knowing it. We laid flowers, and you can see we picked up some school children along the way. And by the Chinese characters on the bottom, this is another photo that made the newspapers there. Let's move ahead. I gave remarks, and I would like to, since this is about a book after all, I'd like to just read you one paragraph that I wrote about what I was feeling then. Standing on that mountainside in southern China, we discovered kind, empathetic people to connect with over shared history and values. We met families who had tilled the land, raised children, and survived war and hardship, largely unnoticed by outsiders. These strong ethnic Yi people, living south of the clouds in Yunnan province, could remember American servicemen with gratitude and honor. I found a small space where an American daughter could wander into a crowd of strangers, seeking memories of her father, and feel welcome. So let's take the next slide. Pat Lucas recounted Bill's story and also the story of his own search for the actual spot that where Bill had been found. In my book, I discovered a poet, a Texas poet, Sarah Cortez, who wrote a book about such memorials. She calls them vanishing points. It isn't where a person is buried, but a place where they died and a place for a memorial. Next slide. The gentleman with his hand on the memorial was Mr. Lee. And it was he and his family who, quote unquote, adopted Bill into their family. And what was interesting, I asked Pat Lucas before I went over, I said, what can I take them? What might they want? And Pat suggested that I bring baby and childhood pictures of Bill, because he said if they've adopted him, they would want to see his childhood photos. Mr. Lee also served in the Army for China, and so he felt some connection with a serviceman. Let's move ahead. We had more flowers laid. Next slide. And right as we were walking away, somebody set off a long chain of Chinese fireworks, as if to say we were here, we made it, we remembered Bill one more time together. It's a beautiful Chinese tradition. Moving ahead, we can see that back at the farmhouse, dinner was being prepared for us, and the little baby grandson was throwing corn cobs into the kitchen stove fire. And it was obviously a task that he was well familiar with, and he was having a ball, giggling, laughing, really having fun. Next. And this is the meal that came out of that kitchen. Most of the produce from their own farm. Very beautiful, very delicious. Next. Larry and I had wanted to give some kind of significant gift to the school, the local school, but we learned that due to some kind of redistricting, most of the students were going to a nearby school. So we opted instead just to give each child in the village, school child, a monetary gift, which we did. These lovely people waited for us in the rain that morning because it was drizzling. But back at the plaza, there they were. And again, this is one of the photos that made the newspaper. Okay, next. Our host arranged some very meaningful things for us. This was one of them. At the time, before the Americans and the British brought their planes into South China, there were no airports or airstrips or any place to land a plane. They had to make them out of the Chinese sacrificed their flat rice fields in various places. And then stone was quarried and brought in by ox cart. And Chinese men, women, and children, I've read that as many as 20,000 worked to crush the rock right on the spot to make gravel runways. And Pat Lucas was able to find two men who, as teenagers, had done this work. And you can see them sitting on the sofa. They have hats on. They look to me like two ancient people that had just stepped out of a history book with their silk jackets and so forth. And we asked them, what was it like when you were youngsters and the war was going on and the Americans came? And they said several things. They said, for the first time, we had hope that we would survive. And the Americans paid us for our work, and we had plenty to eat, mainly meat. So they had not forgotten. Before I left, thinking I might have such an opportunity, I bought those little lapel pins at the State Department store with the cross flags, American and Chinese. And I presented them to these two old gentlemen. And of course, I really wanted to hug them, but I couldn't because I knew that culturally that just wasn't appropriate. But I could really tell that they were touched. They seemed to be really happy that this service that they had rendered was remembered. And of course, on the right, you can see the journalist always with us. Let's move ahead. And then we visited the museum, which has a whole wing dedicated to the Flying Tigers. And I was asked to sign the guest book, which made me very happy. Our guide there, that young woman, was very fluent in English. She had studied in the U.S., history major. It's really amazing to see her. Next. Pat tried to take us to places that servicemen might have visited on rare days of leave. This is one of them. It's a beautiful park right in the middle of Kunming, and that beautiful outdoor dancing that you see all over China. It's so pretty. Next. We also had the experience of going to a home and making dumplings. And if you buy my book, at the very end, I have a recipe for dumplings. I must say that the first ones I made were not very pretty, but a person can learn. So that was a very nice experience to be in a home. It turned out that the people that we visited, their son was studying in Stockholm, and he called while we were there. Okay, moving on. These are a few of the supporters of our project and of the trip. We had a farewell dinner for them to thank them again for all of their hospitality and for their kindness in remembering American servicemen. Next. Not to say that we didn't also have a little bit of tourism. Larry and I did visit the Great Wall on a very windy day. It's the only time in my married life that I ever saw my husband in a hat. He really did not like wearing hats, but we were so cold that he succumbed to it. Next. And we met this interesting fellow in the parking lot, a reminder that in the early days and the travel on the Silk Road and all of the trade that went on in China, camels were a big part of getting things moved around. So, and we did a lot of other things in China, but eventually, we came home and I started thinking, how could I put this story together? Where were the resources that I needed? Next. In spite of the fact that Larry and I had 6 overseas assignments and our belongings went in storage and out of storage and moved around, I fortunately was able to locate the small box of memorabilia that my mother had left for me. Included in that were these letters that she had sent to Bill and that were returned. You can see the handwriting on it, deceased. This must have been really heartbreaking for her at the time. Next. She also saved me a small, the memorabilia, go ahead, from his pilots, from his uniform cap, the Purple Heart that he was awarded, his wings, and a small Bible that his mother had given to him. And also my little baby bracelet that says W.H. Wallace. So I started reading through all the memorabilia and the letters that my mother received from the War Department and other people. And I started putting this all together. Next. I got my reference library together. I put together a file cabinet. I discovered that if I was going to be handling all of this really, important but very fragile letters and so forth, I needed to have a file. Next. Somebody's mic is on. And then, of course, we do have pictures of Bill when he was a young boy already in a uniform. Next. And as a scout, I have a letter from his scout troop master. And there he is with his parents. Next. His high school photo. And when he was working for Sun Oil Company in downtown Dallas. He's the young man on the left. And next. Also, the article from the Dallas Morning News when my parents got married, and there's a picture of my mother. Sometimes I don't think I've written enough about my mother because she was really a resilient woman. She was voted most popular in her senior class, had a great personality, a lot of fun. Everybody loved her, but she was also a very strong woman to make it through all of these trials and tribulations. Let's move on. During the wartime, wives were not allowed to live on base housing. Bill traveled around to 6 different training posts while he was training to be a pilot, and Mother went with him. And often there was 1 or maybe 2 other couples at the base, and they would rent a house close by, and the flyboys, as they were called, would come out on weekends. So as she said, I think they had some pretty fun parties when the guys were home. Next. This is the cockpit of the B-24. I actually got into a B-24 after we came back from China, because at the time there was 1 remaining airworthy B-24, and it flew into Altoona, Pennsylvania. And our family got in a car and went up there to see that plane. I will never forget how I felt standing in that plane and looking at that cockpit, thinking, my gosh, my dad was 25 years old, flying this plane in a foreign country. He probably had only just learned to drive a car, if that. And all of the dangers that they had, and how brave he was to save his crew. So let's move on. Of course, from there on, it was just me and Mom. The little gray Chevy is in the picture here. She's actually a minor character in my book. You'll have to read about her. And I remember traveling in her quite a bit as a youngster. We were back in Dallas. Next. So I started off life with my mother and her parents, my grandparents. And in 1947, my mother remarried to a wonderful man who later adopted me. And that's where my name Goodman comes from. So you'll read in the book a little bit about the breadcrumbs that Pat Lucas had to follow. That's why he couldn't find anybody. Bill only had 1 child, and that child's name was changed. And then, of course, I got married, changed it again. So, but we finally caught up with the story. So I'd like to introduce you to one person who was on the next slide, who was very, very instrumental in helping get our book put together. When you get the book in your hand, you'll see that both inside and on the back cover, there is a reproduction of a calligraphy. I had really wanted to get a calligraphy for this book, but to mimic the words that were on the monument in China. And it's Father, Hero, Never Forgotten. And I found by hook or crook, that's another story, I won't go into it, but John S.C. Wang has been the calligrapher for the Smithsonian Institute here in Washington, D.C. for over 40 years. And I was introduced to him, and he made that calligraphy for me. And just to show you again, I mean, just another example of how the Chinese honor these Americans. When I asked him, I said, Dr. Wang, what do I owe you for this beautiful calligraphy? He said, Judy, you don't owe me anything. I'm doing this to honor your father. Just bring me a copy of the book. So as soon as the book came out, I mean, the very next day, I called him on the phone and made an appointment and took him a book. Move ahead. This is, he made more than one calligraphy. This one does not appear in the book, and it reads top to bottom. Father, Hero, Never Forgotten. Or this one actually says, Always Remember. Next. So there he is, Bill Wallace, and in his dress flight gear. I am so grateful to him. And the next slide just will show you the book. So that's my story. I hope you get a chance to read the book. And if you have any questions or comments, I'll be glad to address them.
Judy, thank you so much. That is such a remarkable story, and it is so wonderful that you still have a lot of photos and the letters from your mom.
Mhm.
That's really, those are treasures, I'm sure. It strikes me from listening to your story, I think I'm not going to think about my spam email quite the same ever again. I mean, it's a good thing that Larry brought that to your attention and you read it. Otherwise, that thing might have just disappeared. And we all do that, but that's pretty amazing. So we will move now to our Q&A, and I'm afraid I only have access to, when I'm in the chat, to the hosts and panelists. So I won't be able to read the questions. Nicole will be doing that, but feel free, please, to type questions in the chat, or if you want to raise your hand, if you'd like to ask your question and want to speak, feel free to do that. If I may start things off, Judy, I have a question for you.
Thank you.
Judy, when you were doing your research, what was the most surprising thing that you learned about your father?
Oh, I learned a lot. I really learned a lot. You don't think you can get to know somebody after they're gone, but actually you can. I knew that he loved music, and I knew that he had a sense of humor. But he wrote some poems for my mother before they were married that were really hilarious, and it was fun to read those. I've included a little bit of that in the book. And I also learned some things about the last place that he was in the United States was Langley, what has become Langley Air Force Base. And I had no idea that's where they did their bombing training. And they put fake targets on the Potomac River. And the pilots would come up and they'd black out the windows, and they would use the newfangled radar that they had to try to identify these spots on the Potomac River. I had no idea that he was training that close to where I've lived much of my life, and the Potomac is such a familiar landmark. I learned a lot of things. I can tell you more, but are there other comments?
Yes, there's some questions in the Q&A. So actually, that's probably the place to ask your question. That's where people have asked questions. So we had a comment, if you can read it to you, from Donna.
Oh, Donna Rachinsky.
Yes.
Yes.
So she just wants to give you a shout out. You were her first Chloe, still my favorite when I was posted to Rio and worked with her husband, Larry. This makes a wonderful story, especially given the fraught state of U.S.-China relations today. So she had to leave, but I wanted to share her comment. Now we have several questions from KH. Number one, did the Lee family say why they felt they needed to adopt him?
Yes, they did. What was described to me, of course, through translations, is that they were there in the village, and Dr. Lucas, had made several trips to that area in search of the plane, and also of the place where they found Bill. And I think they became interested in the story because every couple of years Dr. Lucas would show up, and it just wasn't that common to have somebody prowling around, I guess you could say, in the mountains up there. And the more they knew of the story, they didn't want him to be without a family. I think, you know, in the Chinese, I don't want to say religion, but tradition, you know, everyone has a house and a home in heaven, and they just didn't want him to be left out. So that's when they decided to give him a name and to take care of his monument and to pray for him. Yeah, it was amazing.
Very sweet.
Hmm.
What did your mom think about all this research you did and all you discovered?
I am very sorry to say that she didn't live to know about it. She died in 1998. And in fact, it was her obituary that was what Pat Lucas spotted. Every once in a while, he would do an internet search for William H. Wallace. And I wrote my mother's obituary, and I included his name in her obituary in Oklahoma City. And that's how he found me. That's how Pat Lucas found me. No one, not my mother, my adopted father, my stepfather, no, there's no one left.
But there's you.
But me. And my children, of course.
Yeah. Is the U.S. Embassy planning to help promote this story as it is a great tale of U.S.-China cooperation?
Funny you should mention that because I am trying to make that happen. I've sent information to the public affairs officer who told me that their sort of theme for the year in Beijing is, you know, times when the U.S. and China were cooperating and so forth. And so I am hopeful that we can get something going there. When we were in Kunming and visited the Flying Tigers Museum there, I was made aware that the ambassador had been down there, and they had given him a big welcome and published a book. That was Max Baucus, the previous ambassador. So the fact that they know about flying tigers and love that story is well known there. We'll see. If anybody has friends at the embassy right now, call them up.
Marty's comments, amazing story. Thanks for sharing. I greatly enjoyed reading the book.
Thank you, Marty. That's wonderful. Great to hear from you.
Rebecca Grappo asks, Judy, would you ever consider doing an audiobook? I would so love to hear your voice as I read it.
Well, I would consider that. And of course it is on Kindle now. So you can read it on like that. And I don't know if I really have a radio voice. Some people say they can hear my voice when they read it. Those people who know that I still have a lingering Texas influence. But the answer is yes.
We have a question from Robert, who asks, you speak often of William as Bill in the book rather than calling him your father. Was that in deference to your adopted father?
Yes, definitely. Because I never knew Bill Wallace myself, and he didn't know me. I mean, I never had the opportunity to call him father or dad or anything. And so, and I was always conscious of the fact that my adopted father, whose name is Sandlin Goodman, also served in the military. He was in the Navy. He was a Navy CB. He served in the South Pacific. Unfortunately, his situation was that he contracted one of those, at the time, really horrible illnesses from something he ate or I don't know what, and had to be medevac to San Francisco and then back to Dallas. And he didn't recover. By the time he recovered, the war was over. And he was not, he loved being in the Navy so much. He kept his Navy uniform, well, until it was there when my mother passed away, for heaven's sakes. He never wanted any, he kept that uniform forever. And he was sad that he couldn't get back. So I didn't want that story compared with Bill's heroism to be in conflict. No.
I have a couple people who have raised their hands. Can they ask a question?
Yeah, we have time for one more question.
Okay, so I have Anne Laporta. I'm gonna see if I can. Okay, Anne.
I have no question, but I think it's a wonderful book. And I'm just really happy that that Judy wrote it. That's it.
Thank you.
There is one more question if you want.
Yes.
From Kathy. She says, Judy, as a fellow grandmother, I was curious what your grandsons thought about your book.
This is called Nana's Book Project. They were very patient. This would have been their great-grandfather. And on Veterans Day and on Memorial Day, on a couple of occasions as they were coming up through school, they wrote short papers about Bill Wallace. And I think they're proud of their grandmother for getting it together.
That's cool. That is so cool. All right. Well, to wrap this up, first of all, let me say thank you, Judy, for sharing this amazing story with us. It really is so interesting to hear the details from you and see all those wonderful photographs you had on the slides. Also, Nicole, big thank you for the technical support on this. I just wanted to mention, if you haven't seen this month's Foreign Service Journal, in their own right, Judy's book is featured in there, which is a very cool thing. And then the other thing is, if you go to Amazon.com, if you are interested, you can actually look inside the book, and there's a sample chapter you can look at if you care to read it. So just thought I would add that as well. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We really appreciate your time. We hope this has been an enjoyable time for you and, learning about this fantastic story. Thank you all. Have a great day.
Thank you.